Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
About 1.4 million federal employees missed their first full paychecks last week. The financial hit has led one major federal union to say enough is enough. But the missing paychecks are just one of the several converging challenges feds are facing right now. Here with more is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman, who is writing about all this in this week's edition of the Federal Report. Hey, Drew.
Hey, Jared.
So the organization we are talking about, of course, is the American Federation of Government Employees, taking a stronger stand now on the shutdown. Tell us a bit more about what they're saying.
So they're essentially urging an immediate end to the government shutdown. That's not necessarily surprising in itself, but what they are saying is that they're calling for a clean continuing resolution. They say really that Congress should be focused on passing a clean CR first, working on other negotiations once the government is back up and running. They're asking for lawmakers to just put aside partisan politics and saying that, at the end of the day, this is really just having an impact on, like you said, more than 1 million federal employees who just went without a paycheck at the end of last week. The union talked about how many of these employees are, really feeling this in their wallets. Some are standing in line for food banks. Some are having trouble paying or affording other bills that they're, not getting a paycheck to try to cover. So there's just a lot of financial pain that's building for federal employees right now. The union is saying that it's well past time to just get an end to this government shutdown.
And based on your past experience, you cover these issues closely. I'm not going to go as far as to say this is a surprising statement from AFGE necessarily, but talk us through how it's different than we might have expected in some other circumstances from a large federal employee union.
When you compare what they're saying now versus the stances that they've taken for the better part of this year, it is a little bit different. It's notable mostly because AFGE has been, for the better part of the year, very much opposed to the Trump administration's actions against the federal civil service and Republicans' stance and their rhetoric around federal employees. But now, urging the clean CR, the clean continuing resolution, that's essentially what Republicans are pushing for here as well. So it is an interesting turn of events, so to speak, for AFGE. At the same time, they're one of the major unions that is suing the Trump administration right now over the latest round of reductions in force. So that's not to say that they're, taking back any of those opposition points to the administration right now. But I think what this really boils down to is they're saying this is impacting their members, impacting federal employees. And at the end of the day, that's really what they are trying to advocate for here is the well-being of federal employees.
And yet there's no clear path at the moment to how this shutdown ends, which kind of brings the focus to what can be done to pay feds in certain situations with various workarounds in different situations. What's the latest there? Because that's a big moving target depending on which part of the government you're talking about.
There are some federal employees in certain categories who have been paid. We're coming up on the next paycheck or payday for military members this week. It's unclear whether or not that's going to come through on Wednesday or in the later half of the week. At the same time, there are lawmakers who are trying to work on legislation, at least on the Senate side, to essentially pass immediate pay for federal employees. There are some points of disagreement between Democrats and Republicans where, for example, Senator Ron Johnson, who introduced the Shutdown Fairness Act, was trying to pay only accepted employees. Democrats pushed back and they want furloughed employees to be included in that legislation as well. Ultimately, the battle there led to a failed vote just last week, but it's possible that could eventually lead to some sort of bipartisan agreement. Unclear when that would exactly be, but yes, for the meantime, certain federal employees are being paid due to the Trump administration trying to work around budgets. But for the most part, no, many of them missed paychecks just last week.
And what are the other sort of financial hardships beyond pay? I know you were planning on writing a little bit about that in the Federal Report this week.
That's right. So it's not just missing a paycheck that's the challenge for federal employees right now, but we're seeing a lot of different news pieces converging here. So, for example, just earlier this month, federal employees saw the announcement that they'd soon be paying more than 12% more towards their health premiums starting in January. That's another big insurance premium hike. Last year, there was 13.5%. So 2 years of double-digit percentage increases for health premiums is a really big deal for a lot of federal employees. And, unions like the National Treasury Employees Union are putting that into context as well with President Donald Trump's recommendation of a relatively small pay raise of 1% for next year. So those two, percentages aren't exactly lining up. And then, tied into that too is the cost of living adjustment as well, where, federal employees are going to see some difference in that depending on what retirement system they're in.
Okay, so tell us more about that COLA increase you just mentioned, Drew. I mean, in terms of what people can actually expect starting next January, because it's a little bit complicated.
That's right. So in general, people will be seeing a 2.8% cost of living adjustment, or COLA for short, coming in January 2026. But as many of our listeners who might be in the Federal Employees Retirement System, or FERS, will probably already know that they receive generally a diet COLA or a lower value COLA than the rest of Social Security beneficiaries. They'll be seeing just a 2% boost to their federal retirement annuities. And organizations like the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association, or NARF for short, they talk a lot about how that over time, over many years, can just impact and compound and cost federal employees a lot more at the end of the day, even if it may just be a small percentage year to year. And they also, again, talked about that in comparison with the major premium increases federal employees are going to be facing next year, the small pay raise that federal employees are most likely going to be seeing as well. And then on top of it all, of course, missing paychecks during the government shutdown. So long story short, federal employees are going to be feeling pain points in a lot of different areas right now.
It's sort of reminiscent to me of things like locality pay, another area in which things have just not kept up the way they have supposed to in terms of what the math says the formula is supposed to be. And as you say, these things tend to compound over time. It's not just skipping 1 year of increase and then catching up the following year.
No, I think that's a really good point to make. I mean, if you look just at one single year, the difference in the COLA for 2026, for example, 2% versus 2.8%, that's not going to mean a lot in terms of dollar value. But if you look at that over the course of 10 years or 20 years, that's where organizations like NARF will say that, that's something that can mean thousands of dollars of difference for a federal employee. The same goes, like you said, for, a lot of different factors in this. Locality pay is one where maybe if there's a little bit chipped off every single year, that can mean a lot and compound over time for a lot of people.
All right. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Thanks a lot, Drew.
Thank you. And
you can read a lot more in the Federal Report at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Pentagon's tech pipeline is littered with promising innovations that never make it to the field. MITRE's new transition maturity framework aims to change that by replacing the slow, siloed acquisition process with a collaborative, data-driven approach. For insight on how that framework could help warfighters and why it might be a fix for the ditches of death, we turn to MITRE's Senior Vice President for National Security, Keoki Jackson, who spoke to our Terry Gerton.
This is all about satisfying, in our case, warfighter demands and the mission needs and the operational needs that they face every day when they're employing new technology systems. So what is the valley of death? I actually like to think of it more as, a whole bunch of ditches of death. In a desert where you've got sandstorms and a whole bunch of other things going on. So it's not that there's a big valley that you have to cross, but more that you have to do all of these different things, often in sequence. They're complicated. And so what's happening, if you think of us as a vehicle in the acquisition process, you're stripping the tires, you've destroyed the transmission, and then you've worn all the paint off. And then eventually everybody gives up because you just can't get over the finish line there. So what are some of those problems? And it is, do we have the right technology solution, to an actual mission problem, or is it just technology for technology's sake? Do we understand really what the warfighter needs, those requirements that are validated against the particular problems that they have? Can you make it? Can you actually produce it to the speed, the scale, and at the cost point that you need? And then finally, does the warfighter actually know how to use it? Will they be able to employ it in a real mission operational scenario? So to get across this valley or the ditches of death, those are the kinds of questions that you have to address along the way.
That is really helpful, and I've never heard it described as the ditches of death, but I think that is much more accurate. And the way you describe it, one of the problems that persists is the sequential acquisition process. By the time you get close to that last ditch, who knows if anybody still needs what you thought you were building. So what is MITRE's new transition maturity framework, and how does that purport to help DoD solve this problem?
You bet. So the transition maturity framework combines a set of, I'd say, fairly well-established different maturity levels, but adds in some new pieces. And then what it does is it packages it all together in a set of processes and toolkits that allow a science and technology manager or program manager to actually apply these pieces at the place that they're needed along that journey that I described, so that they know what they're supposed to be doing at any given point to actually make a difference, and also they can measure how they're doing along that process. So think about it this way. We're hacking the complexity of the defense acquisition system so that America's technologists can actually focus on solving technology problems and getting those capabilities to the warfighter instead of navigating the twists and turns of the acquisition system. So let me give a few specifics on that. I mentioned those different readiness levels, and I think everybody or many people are familiar with the technology readiness level. How mature is the actual technology itself? But you also have to think about things like manufacturing readiness level. That gets at the producibility at the cost, the scale, and the schedule that are required. So that's technology and manufacturing readiness level. And then there's a transition readiness level, which says, is it actually navigating the steps for the acquirers, the program executive officers, the program managers on the government side? So on top of those standard elements, now we've added two additional dimensions, if you will. And so this is on what I'd call the requirer side. And we're actually in the process in the Department of War right now of simplifying the entire requirements development process to focus really on those mission needs and challenges. And so now we talk about a requirements readiness level. Is the technology actually aligned to those mission needs? And then finally, and this is critically important because of that last step to adoption, the warfighter readiness level, the WRL, has the technology actually shown that it's ready to be demonstrated, tested, and adopted? And so this gets to a lot of the things that technologists often don't think about. Do we have the doctrine that's required to employ that technology? Do we have a concept of operations? Do we have the logistics in place to make sure that it can be used? Do we have the training so that the people who are going to use this technology actually know what they're supposed to do and how to use it? So those now are all individual steps along in this transition and technology maturation framework that allow this to be employed.
I'm speaking with Keoki Jackson. He's Senior Vice President at MITRE National Security. Give us a feel for how this framework actually gets used in practice.
So I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about the specific application. And I want to highlight this was developed by the Operational Energy Innovation Organization with the Pentagon's Acquisition and Sustainment Branch. And so OEI for short, they're the ones that are charged with coming up with solving many of the energy and power problems that warfighters face in the field. But that means taking a lot of advanced technology, and what they don't have they don't have these large acquisition programs like a next generation air dominance fighter or something like that that's going to pull those through. So they need to be matching along the way all the time the technologists with the industrial base, with the end users. And so since 2012, they've actually been developing and maturing this idea, this maturation framework to be able to employ their new technologies and get them out into the field. So I have to give kudos to OEI for really taking an idea and then bringing it to their warfighting partners, but also developing something that now is usable by programs across the entire department.
I want to go back to those 5 different readiness level topics that you mentioned. technology, manufacturing, transition requirements, and warfighter readiness. Is it too simple to say that what you're talking about is sort of the equivalent of moving from waterfall software development to agile development, where you get everybody around the table, you do rapid cycles and things move a little more quickly and everyone is engaged in the conversation from stage to stage?
You're exactly right, because these are not things, you don't want to bolt on the warfighter readiness at the end. You need to be thinking about all of these things in parallel. But the important thing to note with the transition maturity framework is there are specific activities that you do need to do at different points in time, and you may be at different readiness levels in each of those 5 dimensions that we talked about. So what the framework gives you is an easy-to-use process and toolkit for identifying at each step and each maturity level across those dimensions, what are the specific activities that I need to prioritize right now as a technology development or program manager. And so that gives you a menu, it gives you the prioritization, and it gives you a way to think about the problem that's very tailored to the steps that you might be at any particular time.
So that's helpful. There also seems to be another trick to this, and MITRE often emphasizes its zero-stake neutrality. And as you're thinking about getting all of these different groups together more regularly in the development of a weapon system or a product or whatever, there are increasingly very different commercial interests represented at each of those stages. So how does that impact the effort to scale these programs, and why is zero-stake neutrality so important in that process?
Thanks for asking that, Terry. So MITRE operates the National Security Engineering Center, FFRDC, that's federally funded research and development center. And as a nonprofit, we maintain a strict neutrality, and we're free from organizational and financial conflicts of interest that would cause us to pick a particular solution or a particular winner, other than what's best for the department, what's best for the warfighter. And so that allows us, because we're not competing with any of the stakeholders in this, the commercial solution providers, with the new defense tech entrants, with our defense industrial base, we're able to bring together both the key government stakeholders. These are the requirements developers, these are the warfighters, these are the acquisition process experts, and bring them together with our traditional defense industrial based providers, as well as these new and emerging companies with great ideas but have no idea how to navigate the complexity of the acquisition process, getting from getting in the door to actually getting something out to a warfighter. So MITRE's convening ability and the ability to systems engineer processes that really look at what are the things that are needed at each step of the way and how do they fit together in a way that actually produces the desired outcome. That's the advantage of having the neutrality that you talked about, but also the ability to take a step back and a real systems view. Because at the end of the day, we need to get away from these one-off solutions and what I'd call random examples of success to something that's a lot more systematic and strategically important in defense acquisition.
So you mentioned that the technology or transition maturity framework was piloted in sort of a small way. What's next for it? How does it scale up now to be a key enabler of major acquisition programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I noted, this started in OEI, but it's actually being bridged out to a lot of different areas now. So let me give you a couple examples. One is we've got a tool called Omni that actually allows you to manage this process and gives you the progress as well as the data-driven insights. So now you've got a tool that can be transplanted into different acquisition organizations and S&T organizations. Some of the things that we're working on right now are particularly focusing on bringing in new entrants and new defense technology type companies, the startups, the people who are less familiar with the department. So we think there's a great opportunity on that front to bring in advanced new commercial solutions much faster. And the second is adopting this to, in particular, software development and agile software development. So much of what the department needs and is acquiring today is effectively software defined and software centric. So this is obviously a huge area of focus in terms of getting transition out to the warfighter.
Keoki Jackson is Senior Vice President and General Manager at MITRE National Security. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive and subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Trump administration's second term has triggered an exodus from the Justice Department. Over 100 senior career officials have departed in just 8 months. Civil rights, immigration, and environmental enforcement units are among the most affected, raising alarms about institutional memory and legal capacity. Here with more details and analysis is Bloomberg Law reporter Suzanne Moniak. She spoke with Terry Gerton.
We found that more than a third of career managers at the Justice Department have left this year since the start of the second Trump administration. This is pretty unusual because leaders who are hired through the career process tend to stay through political administrations. They're not political appointees. They stay sometimes for decades, even with the government.
So what kind of roles are we talking about here? Are they lawyers, managers, all of the above?
A mix of both. We used a federal directory posted by the Office of Personnel Management under government transparency law that included more than 300 career leaders at the Justice Department. They include some members of the senior executive service and other management positions. Some of them are lawyers, some of them are not.
Are there particular sectors in the Department of Justice that were more impacted by these departures than others?
Yes, even though it was about a third overall, at least. We saw more than 3/4 of, for example, the Civil Rights Division of those managers had left during the second administration. This, I think, is a reflection of how hard of a pivot that division has taken under this administration to align with the second Trump administration's ideological priorities.
And what about immigration and environmental divisions? They seem to be pretty significantly impacted as well.
Yes, we really saw a lot of the attrition in divisions that affected policy areas that the administration has really targeted. So the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which is the component that houses the immigration courts, and the Environmental Division, which enforces environmental laws across the country, lost about half of its career leaders, at least.
We certainly hear a lot of talk in the press and in the political cycles about the Department of Justice. But what exactly do these folks do on a day-to-day basis? Are they defending the government? Are they prosecuting? What is their day-to-day role?
It really varies. We looked at more than 300 roles across the department. So yes, there are attorneys who are in management roles, maybe overseeing litigators. We're also seeing people leaving within the human resources section of the Justice Department. So it really just runs the gamut in the types of roles that they are. But what they have in common is that they were all appointed through the career process. And that's a merits-based process. And a lot of those people have many years, if not decades, of experience each.
Right. And you mentioned that usually these folks stay regardless of the party that's in control of the presidency. So what makes this cycle of departure so unusual?
Well, that's exactly it. Most people, a lot of people, when they join the federal government, that's a career for life for them. And some of the people that I spoke to for this story, they never saw themselves leaving at this time or retiring early. They saw this as where they were going to spend the rest of their careers. And then when this administration took over, deferred resignation offers came out, and some of the divisions just had to take a very different stance than they had taken in the past. And they were being asked to do work they hadn't been asked to do in the past that really just represented a departure from the work that had been done previously. And there's just been an environment under this administration to really push out federal workers. And I think that's something that administration officials have been pretty open about, that they want to get deep state actors out of government, as they describe them, and they want to do a fresh start or a redirect. And so we really did see that across the Justice Department and across the government more broadly, as people took those offers, were pushed out and left.
Were the majority of these DOJ departures as a result of the DRP?
It's hard to say exactly why everyone left. Some people, will disclose why they left in posts. Some people do not. Quite a few were from the deferred resignation offer. Absolutely. 2 of those went out this year, which allowed federal government employees to remain on paid leave through the end of the fiscal year, which ended at the end of September. But we also saw people who were, fired. We saw people who left voluntarily, technically, but after being forcibly reassigned or demoted. Some people, career managers with many years of experience, were put in a task force called the Sanctuary Cities Working Group, which ended up being known as a task force that, didn't do meaningful work, at least in the view of a lot of the people there, and now has no one working there. None of the people reassigned there are still with the department.
I'm speaking with Suzanne Moniak. She's a reporter at Bloomberg Law. So, Suzanne, with this significant departure, a third of the Department of Justice leaders, but concentrated in some particular divisions, what happens to DOJ's functionality and effectiveness? Like, this seems to represent a significant loss of institutional memory. How will that impact how DOJ does its work?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's one that a lot of former officials, a concern that they raised in interviews for this story. It's absolutely a significant loss of expertise and institutional memory. One role that career people will really have throughout the government is that when political administrations change, you'll see new political appointees come in, and maybe they have experience, doing this work at the career level, maybe they don't. And having a career staff already in place, knowing how things work, knowing what to do, I'm told can really sort of ease that transition as the politicals come in and out, as administrations change. Certainly, I think with this amount of loss, they're going to be doing hiring. But until those new people are in place, I cannot help but imagine that there will be some compromise of functionality to the Justice Department.
Well, you mentioned the expectation that they would be hiring, and yet the federal government remains under a hiring freeze across the board. Has DOJ received any exceptions for that to begin hiring to replace these folks?
There have been exceptions made. We've seen hiring, for example, at the Civil Rights Division, the one that lost more than 76% of its career managers. It also lost a number of its lower level attorneys as well. And we have already seen hiring in that division. The political leader heading it has been posting on social media, we're hiring. So we are seeing some enthusiasm from administration officials to kind of bring those people on. So yes, there have been exceptions made.
We've been talking here about the divisions that were most significantly impacted by departures, but were there others that weren't, so that their workload kind of continued on?
Yes, we saw lower levels of departures in the criminal division, for example. I think that one was slightly less affected. At the civil division, whose attorneys handle a lot of the litigation against the Trump administration's federal policies, they lost at least about a quarter of their career managers. So while we did see pretty high shares across the board, there were certainly some that were below that 1/3 we saw overall.
And DOJ also has a pretty large responsibility for enforcing tax laws, right? They have a tax division. How were they affected?
Yes, the tax division lost at least a third of its career managers, so right around that across the board point. The National Security Division lost about half. And I should also mention that these are really all minimum numbers. These were departures that we were able to confirm and be sure of, but it's likely an undercount because there are people who will still be on the website even though they've left, and people are leaving every day. So in between when I report the story and it publishes, we might even have had a few more departures.
And so as you talk to folks either in or recently in the Department of Justice, what's their takeaway? What does this mean for the effectiveness of the department and its future?
I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of concerns, both about its ability to do its work and about morale across the department. One of the appeals of working in the government is having a stable job that you can spend years and years doing. And that ideal, I think, has really been eroded under this administration, and that's not specific to the Justice Department. We're seeing that everywhere. And I also think there's been a lot of concerns about politicization at the Justice Department, as we're seeing a lot of career people leaving, people who've worked through multiple political administrations from both parties who, their goal is just to do their job and enforce or argue the laws as they see them, or as they're supposed to. We see with more political people coming in, career people coming out, I think that just kind of fuels those concerns that this department might be more politicized under this administration than it has in the past.
And the technicalities of the cases that the Department of Justice handles are pretty significant. So it's not like you can just walk in from a private sector commercial firm and understand the roles of the Department of Justice, right?
Absolutely. A lot of people at DOJ have talked about how, what they do. It is a niche expertise. It is something that you have to learn how to do. That, it's just as you said, working at a big firm would not necessarily, you wouldn't come in knowing exactly what to do, hitting the ground running always. And so there is something to be said for having had that experience in the government, for having argued in court for the government for years and know what you're doing before you, say, become a manager. So, and, you see that really from the top down. When people lose their managers, it affects morale at the lower levels as well.
And do you think in the long run, is this likely to affect the success of the DOJ in the cases that it does bring before the courts?
It's certainly hard to say. I'm sure the administration would say that it wouldn't, that they're going to bring in new people. But I think when speaking to former officials, many don't see another option of that than that. When you've lost people who know what they're doing, who've successfully argued cases, it's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be some kind of negative effect on their ability to successfully push through cases. And we've even seen that some in courtrooms. We've seen prosecutors be rebuked by federal judges for their conduct in courtrooms. And while, it's hard to draw that direct through line to say, oh, well, it's because of the attrition, I think it's a very possible, if not likely, result of people with career expertise deciding to leave.
Suzanne Moniak is a judiciary reporter at Bloomberg Law. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive and subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. There is word today that some staff at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are coming back to work this week. In this case, we're talking specifically about the employees who process invoices and payments for government contractors. But even if that happens as planned, they'll be facing a big backlog of work, and that's likely to mean payment delays for vendors. A lot to talk about this week with Stephanie Castro, the president of the Professional Services Council. And Stephanie, let's start with this CMS issue, because as you and I were talking about a little bit off the air, this is certainly not the only case in which the invoicing staff at federal agencies has been furloughed. But let's focus first on CMS. What impacts are you seeing there, and what's it meant so far, if anything, in terms of delays?
Well, Jared, thanks for having me. And this is an interesting area that you're tackling here, first off. And that is to say, several weeks ago, many of our companies that work with Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services highlighted to us that folks in charge of invoice processing, so those who can receive invoices, process, get them out all the way to payment, had been furloughed. Now, that wasn't an entire surprise if you look at how this shutdown has impacted federal civilians and military personnel alike. The civilian side, they have seen lots of furloughs in contracting officers, in program offices, et cetera, folks that companies deal with on a daily basis. The invoicing piece is a new wrinkle, and I'll say that because a lot of these contracts are funded by prior year funding, so fiscal year 25 appropriations, not dependent on fiscal 26, or fee-based for sources of income. Therefore, when you furlough the invoice processing people, that means the companies who are still doing essential services and providing essential work to the government and should have money to tap into to pay for their work are running into a brick wall. And this is causing a lot of pain among many of our companies.
It's such an important point to point out, because there are a lot of these areas across the federal government where just because the government has shut down doesn't mean the work is not still occurring. Healthcare is still taking place and people need to be paid for it. So in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the impacts, have you started to hear anecdotes from your members about people being put in precarious situations by not being paid in a timely way?
I have, Jared, and thanks for asking that, because I would note, hasten to add, based on my last comment here, the head of contracting agency over at CMS did send a note to all CMS contractors last week that said, hey, we've heard you, and the furloughed employees in charge of invoicing will be back in the office on Monday the 27th. So that is this week, right? And that's great news. But of course, invoices have backed up. That doesn't mean everything is smooth sailing from here on out. Again, using fiscal year 25 appropriations and fee-based situations. That said, in that gap, because invoices were sent in, potentially even accepted for payment, but then not processed, some companies have claims for equitable adjustments for that time period for costs incurred as a direct result of the government's inaction or delay. I would say CMS might get some leeway due to the shutdown is outside of their control, as it is for many of us, outside of our control. But that catch-up process isn't unreasonable, right? So I think we need a lot of flexibility and grace on both sides here to make sure that folks get paid in a timely way. And of course, we are talking about contracts that are not covered by a stop work order. If a company gets a stop work order, the first thing they do is stop work, right? And then they start documenting any costs incurred. That said, some of these companies do need invoice payments because they are very labor intensive. They need to pass those payments on to their employees who need to pay their mortgages, feed their families, etc. Similar situation to all of the federal employees who are going without pay. Fortunately for federal employees, they do have a law on the books from 2019 that guarantees back pay. Contractors don't have that. And so what we're talking about here is not back pay. It's actually payment for work performed and for reasonable invoices. I would also note, we are recommending that companies really track all additional projected costs for payroll retention or subcontractor payments, financing, overhead from delays, et cetera, that have resulted. And so what we're trying to avoid here is the clock starts ticking once an invoice is accepted by a federal agency, and that clock runs out according to the Prompt Payment Act. And if the government doesn't make those payments on time, they start incurring fees or interest, and then they owe more to the contractors. Everybody wants to avoid that situation.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I was just going to ask about that. Based on past shutdowns, are there any exceptions to the Prompt Payment Act by virtue of the government being shut down, or is the clock basically no matter what as soon as the government accepts the invoice?
So the key phrase here, Jared, is that an invoice has to be accepted for that clock to start ticking. And so what the government could do is just not accept that payment into the system, and therefore the clock for the Prompt Payment Act doesn't start. So it really is a small subset of contracts that I'm talking about and invoices that I'm talking about, but they're not zero. There are invoices out there that the clock has been ticking. They're going to probably bust through that Prompt Payment Act window, and then costs will be incurred on the government's behalf to pay the contractor the penalties due.
Got it. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the big AI regulatory reform RFI that the Office of Science and Technology Policy has just put out. Tell us a little bit about what OSTP is actually proposing here and how it fits into so much executive order action on the topic of AI across the last couple administrations.
There has been so much activity on AI, and I think that's because it was long overdue. You've got lots of agencies and departments interested in artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. And this was a long anticipated, RFI coming from the government saying, hey, where do we need help here? What regulations are causing delays and hindering advancement, both in the development and the deployment of artificial intelligence across the government? And so OSTP, this Office of Science and Technology Policy, is an office, obviously, in the White House. So this has the highest level of attention. As you mentioned, there are lots of executive orders in this as well. And so industry really welcomed this RFI that came out in late September. Comments were due yesterday, October 27th. And we submitted probably PSC's longest set of comments in my memory. And I've been with PSC for 4.5 years. It was quite detailed. Lots of companies had lots of input. And I'm happy to go over a few of the high points if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Sure. So just generally speaking, it's fair to say that PSC and our member companies support the government's two emphases, right? One emphasis is on fostering competition and innovation within the federal marketplace. And the second is sort of mom and apple pie, right? Maintaining U.S. leadership across the globe on artificial intelligence and other emerging tech. So when we look at those two emphases, right, maintaining competition, then also demonstrating U.S. leadership, we have to get rid of some of these arcane and archaic regulations that are really holding back the art of the possible here. So one of those is reasonable access to federal government data. As we all know, to train AI models and tools, you need access to data to let it know what right looks like, right? You feed it information and it crunches the numbers and it crunches the data and it does spit stuff out, but then you have to train that model, right, to make sure that it's giving you the kind of output that you would like. The second one, in addition to access to federal government data, is we have a very fragmented regulatory landscape. Every single state that I know of has some sort of law on the books regarding artificial intelligence. It seems a little bit like the federal government is playing catch up here. And I do think there is a really good role for the federal government to play in order to help responsible AI adoption, is to look at that patchwork of state privacy and AI laws and take a wide-ranging view on that. I would love to see a unified federal framework for AI and data privacy that harmonizes or supersedes conflicting state laws. So that's the second piece, the fragmented regulatory landscape. And the third one that I'd mention just offhand is there's a lot of rigidity in procurement processes. Jared, you and I talk about this quite often, right? There's not enough flexibilities, or flexibilities are on the books, but contracting officers don't want to use them because they're either unfamiliar or there's some risk to them involved in using some of these flexibilities. I think we need to get past that when it comes to AI. We need to look at how to create flexibility in procurement and how to make sure that we aren't disincentivizing the sharing of data rights through licensing structures. So those would be the three I'd mention: access to federal government data, a unified federal framework for AI in terms of regulations, and then also let's take a look at procurement rigidity.
And when it comes to that patchwork that you mentioned, when you think about the ideal scenario, does that look more like the federal government preempting those state-based standards or coming up with something that's just more specific to federal contractors, or both?
So I think there is space for both in this. Obviously, PSC has 400 member companies. We are active in the government contracting space. That's our federal marketplace, right? And so I would love to see, first and foremost, compliance that is streamlined in order to accelerate responsible AI adoption and reinforce U.S. leadership in trustworthy AI development specific to federal procurement. That said, AI is throughout our economy at this point. It does run into privacy issues. And so if the federal government could take a look at reducing operational uncertainty, lowering compliance costs, not impeding innovation across the board, and that will mean when states are in conflict on AI and on privacy, which will supersede the other. And I think the federal government has a role to play in resolving those conflicts.
Need to go to break in just a minute here, but want to make sure we mention the PSC Defense Conference coming up this week on Thursday. It's always a great conference, but give us a minute or so on what you guys expect to tackle this year.
I appreciate that, Jared. It's tough to have a conference during a shutdown, but we are forging ahead. And indeed, we're having several folks from Capitol Hill, not only members of Congress, but senior professional staff members come to talk about topics like aligning energy demand and investment for the future defense industrial base. So not just small modular reactors, but also how are we going to do electrification throughout the base structure at the Department of War or Department of Defense. We're also talking about unlocking and implementing commercial solutions across our defense ecosystem and strengthening the partnerships within the defense enterprise. So those are going to be some key topics. We'll have keynotes from Congressman Rob Whitman, as well as the newest member of Congress from this area, who is James Walkinshaw here from Virginia. We're also here from a member of Congress from Florida named Scott Franklin, and he'll talk about that energy topic that I mentioned.
All right. Stephanie Castro is president of the Professional Services Council. Thanks as always, Stephanie.
Thanks, Jared.
The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has been sounding the alarm about cyber threats to U.S. critical infrastructure like power and water systems. CISA officials are particularly concerned about hackers targeting so-called operational technology or OT systems. Targeting of those systems could pose major health and safety risks. For more on what the agency is doing to combat those threats, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday spoke with the OT cyber lead at CISA, Matt Rogers.
I think there's two primary threat actors I'm concerned about, or at least categories of actor. One are these lower skill, lower sophisticated threat actors who are targeting internet exposed components. So they're finding an internet exposed OT device, they're just searching on a service like Shodan or something else. They're finding it, and then they're logging in. Maybe it doesn't have a password. Maybe it's using a default password, or increasingly it's just using a password that's pretty simple to crack. And then they're doing that. They're messing around with the interface. And right now, they haven't caused substantial, really expensive impacts to those individual entities. But these people might get more skilled over time. And this is a sort of threat actor where it's not like more sophisticated threat actors won't use the internet exposed assets. It's just a little noisy right now. The other side of this is Volt Typhoon, more of these PRC-affiliated nation-state, high-skilled nation-state threat actors who are coming in from the IT side, compromising edge devices, dumping credentials, and then trying to then pivot into the OT network, both from a pre-positioning, creating a societal panic perspective, but also from the idea of, can we exfiltrate information about the OT network so that we can do more harm and do more damage to it than just either making sure that we can execute a denial of service or making sure that we can do something much more scary and cause, real substantial harm. So, that's what I'm really concerned about. And that's why a lot of the CISA efforts are focused on, well, how do we uplift the resiliency of existing infrastructure such that even if there is a successful attack, the impact of it is lower. And, that's through efforts like INL's cyber-informed engineering work, which, they champion alongside the Department of Energy, but also through some of these secure by design efforts to say, well, how can we embed security in these components such that we can reduce the likelihood of a successful attack?
Makes a lot of sense. And Matt, from the cybersecurity perspective, I think there's a lot of playbooks out there for how organizations at this point can secure their enterprise IT. But what is the playbook for these OT systems?
Yeah, we've pushed out a lot of guidance in this area, from asset inventory, sort of the high level know what you have guidance, to how do you do vulnerability management for these OT systems with tools like SSVC, which allows you to do basically a mapping of, hey, given a vulnerability, how big of a deal is it for the corresponding system to go down? Do I need to prioritize this immediately? Do I need to prioritize this later? So we have sort of that higher level guidance. For the sector specific resilience, I really do think it comes down to the domain expertise and sort of the crown jewels of the day, because there are kind of a lot of different approaches to securing operational technology. I would say the vast majority that we see is sort of kind of a bubble method, which is this idea of we're going to focus a lot on segmentation and we're going to focus a lot on continuous monitoring around the edge of that perimeter of the bubble and maybe a little bit inside of the bubble. And we're basically hoping that a threat actor isn't able to compromise the actual OT network. Now, with threat actors like Vault Typhoon, CISA is very concerned about that approach because we need more defense in depth. We need more ability to understand and prevent the impact if they actually got access to the OT network. And that's where a lot of these ideas like CIE come in. It's where we start asking more questions about where do we prioritize monitoring? What are the crown jewels of your systems? What do you care about? I mean, like we were talking about earlier, I mean, a specific example for avionics would be, there's protocols that are still in use today, like MIL Standard 1553, like ARINC 429, where a lot of them have safety protocols that are built in, where you just send a single message and all of the computers turn off. Now, the reason why all of the computers turn off is because it's built for safety. If a computer is having a hardware failure and breaks down, obviously you want to be able to switch to whatever redundant avionics computer you have. And so it just makes sense. Like it's really well engineered. It's really well designed. It just isn't really well designed for cybersecurity threats around a malicious actor. And so if you're thinking about, hey, like, as an asset owner, what can I actually do to fix this legacy problem that I have? You have a couple of different options, right? You could say, well, I don't think somebody is reasonably going to get access to this network. So I'll harden the boundary points. I'll say, okay, to get access to my plane, well, it's an RF attack vector, a physical access point. Well, I've got physical security. I can harden these particular components. I think I'm good. That's one approach. You can add continuous monitoring onto the actual network itself and try to identify anomalies. Now, that might get really expensive. Or you can start doing things like ripping and replacing old components to try and actually do those upgrades. Now, that's really expensive. Most entities aren't going to get there. And more along to the sort of CIE, secure by design approach, what I really want to encourage is thinking about what are those critical components where, hey, this is your bad day if this gets attacked. So in a lot of these avionic systems, there's a key mission computer, a bus controller, and it tells everybody else what to do. And so if you are going to send any of these attacks by sending these erroneous safety messages, well, they usually originate from that singular bus controller, that singular crown jewel in your network. And so if you add a bunch of security to that singular component, well, that's a much more reasonable cost than adding, cryptographic key modules to all of your computers designed in the 1980s, right? That isn't going to go very well for most people. And so you can start thinking about where can I do these targeted small scale upgrades with, in the now, and start thinking about procurement and how do I buy myself or upgrade my existing systems in the future once I have a bit better capital expenditure window to actually do larger scale systemic upgrades.
That's a fantastic example. Appreciate that. And one thing I was wondering early on, you mentioned that CISA offers free services to critical infrastructure, vulnerability scanning, and other things to help them address some of these issues. What kind of uptake have you seen on those? And are you looking to make any improvements or additions going forward?
Well, we're always looking to improve our services, which may be too easy of an answer, but we do have quite good uptake for those, particularly the ones that scale better, like external vulnerability scanning. I mean, we have over 10,000 critical infrastructure entities that have signed on to those services. We're always capped out on the assessments we do every year. We basically are at the limit for our current capacity for how many we can do. But as part of a lot of these assessment modernization efforts, as part of a lot of our incident response efforts, we're actively in the process of improving the services so that they can scale to more people. It might be a lower fidelity version than sending a bunch of OT experts to your door in person, but seeing where we can actually improve and scale those offerings to give everybody a little bit more of a bit of a security insight into their operational technology network. Now, that might be through our regions, working with our cybersecurity advisors in the field. We encourage everybody to talk to their regional advisors. You go on CISA.gov/regions. It'll tell you who that is. You can get in touch there and get some more hands-on in-person help. But for the actual, deep technical in the weeds cybersecurity expertise, we're going to prioritize those to the systemically important entities. But we still have to help everybody else, right? Because it's regardless, if that critical infrastructure goes down, it's still a bad day for a lot of people. And so we're working to scale our services so that we can get broader uptake amongst those smaller groups, like the munis, like the co-ops.
Does that come down to essentially funding and the amount of capacity that you have to be able to offer those services at this point?
Yes. I mean, there's 50,000 plus like water entities that have served less than 3,000 people. So, realistically, we're not going to go through site by site and go to all of those entities. But in practice, right, like we do want to provide cybersecurity assistance, and those entities do matter, particularly to their local communities. And so we are trying to improve and offer more services that scale better to hit both those small and large audiences. And you also have to think, coming back to some of your workforce points, we also need the capacity to make sure that they can actually understand our recommendations, right? How do we tailor our guidance for different maturity levels? Because if the security person at that small water entity is also running their engineering, has a ton of other tasks they're doing in a day, well, maybe a 50-page how-to manual is not the best approach. But giving more targeted recommendations tailored to their maturity level is going to be a lot better. And so, we're actively doing work to make sure that our existing services are consumable, but always improving those to make sure that they can reach more people.
That's Matt Rogers, the Operational Technology Cyber Lead at CISA, speaking with Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. To watch their full conversation, go to federalnewsnetwork.com and check out our Cyber Leaders Exchange.